My mother said it while she was carving the Thanksgiving ham, casual as reading off a grocery list. This land goes to blood. You were never blood. 14 people heard her say it. She thought that sentence was the end of something. She had no idea it was about to be the end of the wrong thing, and that in about 90 seconds, I was going to lay 3 pieces of paper on that tablecloth that had been sitting in a drawer for 9 years, waiting for exactly this moment. Welcome to Betrayal and Justice, where ordinary families collide with the truth and the quiet ones win. My name is Ren Callahan. I'm 35. For 9 years, I've built family trees for a forensic lab that helps police departments close cold cases with DNA nobody thought would ever talk again. I'm good at my job because I understand exactly how long a secret survives before the math finally catches up with it. I never once thought the secret I'd have to solve would be my own. I have to take you back 9 years, to the December I turned 26, because that's the winter everything I thought I knew about my family quietly stopped being true. I grew up on Larkspur Ridge, 212 acres of Kentucky hill country that had belonged to a Callahan since 1951, when my great-grandfather Silas cleared it with a mule and a debt he never fully paid off. The house sat at the top of a long gravel drive, white clapboard gone soft gray at the edges, with a wraparound porch my grandfather repainted every other summer whether it needed it or not, because a Callahan porch, he liked to say, was the first thing people saw and the last thing they should ever have reason to criticize. By the time I was born, the farm didn't run cattle anymore. My grandfather Earl leased most of the pasture and kept a smaller orchard going for income, and the family held on to that land the way other families hold on to a name. You didn't sell it. You didn't split it. You certainly didn't marry someone who might complicate who it belonged to next. My father, Roger, was Earl's only son. My mother, Denise, married into that name at 22 and spent the next 3 decades making sure everyone in Larkin County knew she'd earned her place in it. My brother Tucker came 2 years after me, and from the time he could walk, he was the one who got taken up to the fence line to learn where the property ended. I was the one who got taken to church. Nobody ever said it was about blood. Nobody had to. I felt it the way you feel a draft in an old house. You can't point to the crack, but you dress warmer near that one wall without ever quite deciding to. I want to be fair about my childhood, because it wasn't cruel. It was just precise. I got clothes, a bedroom, a seat at the table every single night. What I didn't get was ease. The specific, unearned ease Tucker carried. The sense that the ground under his boots already knew his name before he did. When I was 9, I asked my mother why Tucker got to walk the ridge with Grandpa Earl, and I never did. She was folding towels at the time. She didn't look up. He's not going up there for the view, Ren. He's going up there to learn what he's going to inherit. I stood in that laundry room doing math no 9-year-old should have to do, and coming up short and not understanding why. 12 was the year I understood I was supposed to stop asking. That was the Christmas Grandpa Earl gave Tucker his late father's pocket watch in front of the whole family and told him someday the land would need a Callahan who remembered where it came from. He looked right past me to say it. I remember holding my own gift, a sweater, gray, practical, and understanding that some inheritances get announced out loud and some get decided in silence, and I had just watched which kind was going to be mine. By the time I was 16, I'd mostly stopped noticing the small things, the way you stop noticing a hum in an old refrigerator. What I remember most from that year is my father, not Denise, Roger. He wasn't a man who said much, but he came to every track meet I ever ran, stood at the fence line in his work boots with his arms crossed, and drove me home afterward without once asking why I hadn't placed higher, the way some fathers do. Tucker didn't run track. Tucker played baseball, and Grandpa Earl came to those games instead, sat in the bleachers with the other men from the co-op, and talked land prices during the 7th inning stretch. I used to think Roger only came to my meets because Earl had already claimed Tucker's games. Looking back now, from the other side of everything I'm about to tell you, I think Roger just liked watching me run. I didn't understand yet how much that plain, unremarkable fact was going to matter later. I chose my career almost by accident. In 10th grade, a history teacher assigned a family tree project, and I was the only kid in class who turned it into an obsession. 3 generations, then 5, then a mail-order DNA kit I bought with babysitting money because I wanted to see the numbers behind the names. I didn't know yet that numbers can hold things a name can't hide. I just knew I liked that a strand of DNA didn't care what anyone in a small town had already decided to believe about who belonged to whom. It only ever told you the truth, on a schedule of its own choosing. I went to the University of Kentucky for biology, then a graduate program in forensic genetics, and by 26 I was working under a woman named Priya Oduya at a lab in Louisville that used genealogy the way it's rarely used, pointed backward into cold cases 20 and 30 years old, instead of forward into ancestry charts for hobbyists. My first year there, I helped identify a body that had sat unnamed in a county morgue for 11 years, just by building out 4 generations of a stranger's family tree from a single distant cousin's public DNA upload. I remember standing in Priya's office when the detective called to confirm the match, thinking, this is the only job in the world where the truth actually wants to be found, if you're patient enough to let it. My coworker Desmond, who sat in the cubicle next to mine for 6 of those 9 years, used to joke that I was the only person in the building who got emotional over a spreadsheet. He wasn't entirely wrong. There is nothing quite like watching a name reattach itself to a person who had spent over a decade being called nothing but a case number in a county filing cabinet. I was careful in that job the way I had learned to be careful my whole life, checking every match twice, trusting the data over the story a family had always told itself. Because families, I already knew by then, will tell themselves almost anything before they'll sit with an inconvenient fact. I loved that work with the specific, quiet love you have for something that finally lets you be useful in exactly the shape you already are. I never once imagined that shape would eventually have to hold my own family's inconvenient fact, too. The December I turned 26, Priya had the whole team run our own kits as a training exercise, so we'd understand the software the same way our clients eventually would. I remember sitting at my desk with a cup of gas station coffee, clicking into my own results the way I'd clicked into 200 strangers' results that year, expecting absolutely nothing. My mother had done one of the big consumer kits 4 years earlier, a Mother's Day gift from Tucker, and out of habit I'd already loaded her raw data into our lab software months before, the way you'd flip through an old photo album on a slow afternoon. So when my own results came back, the software didn't just draw me a family tree, it ran a comparison. Denise Callahan, shared DNA consistent with mother and daughter. That much I already knew. But 3 rows down, flagged in the green highlighting we use at the lab to mark a confirmed close relative, was a name I had never once heard at a Callahan Thanksgiving, a Callahan Christmas, a Callahan funeral. Harlan Voss. Shared DNA, 3612 centimorgans. In my line of work, that number means exactly one thing. Not an uncle, not a half-sibling, a parent. I sat at that desk for 11 minutes before I moved. I counted them, because counting is the only thing that keeps my hands steady when the rest of me wants to shake. 11 minutes, staring at a name that had never come up once, in 35 years, in a family that prided itself on knowing exactly whose blood ran where. 11 minutes to understand that whatever my mother knew, she had known it since before I could walk, and had built an entire household around the shape of never telling me. I didn't call her that night. I didn't call anyone. I did the one thing I always do when the ground moves under me. I opened a case file, the same kind I open for strangers, and I started building, quietly, the way I'd build any other family tree nobody had asked me to touch yet. For 3 days after that, I told the office I had a stomach bug and worked from my apartment instead, mostly because I needed to run the panel twice more before I trusted it, the same way I'd have made any client wait for a second confirmation before I called with news that would rearrange their whole understanding of themselves. The second run matched the first. The third did too. On the 4th day I went back to work, made myself a cup of gas station coffee, exactly like the one that had been sitting next to my keyboard when this all started, and opened a blank case file the way I'd open one for anybody else who'd ever walked through our door, not knowing yet what their own DNA was about to tell them. It took me 4 months to find him properly, working it the way I'd work any client's case. I didn't have his name yet, only a green triangle of shared DNA and a scatter of distant cousin matches. So I built the tree the slow, correct way. Public marriage records, obituaries, a county historical society's digitized yearbooks, cross-referencing until the branches narrowed down to one man who fit every point on the chart. I never once let myself shortcut it by simply searching a name, the way I'd have warned any client against doing. Rushing a family tree is how you end up knocking on the wrong door with somebody's whole life in your hands. Harlan Voss turned out to be 61, a retired shop teacher running a small furniture repair business out of a converted barn 40 minutes from where I'd grown up, close enough that I must have driven past his turnoff 100 times without ever knowing it. He'd dated my mother 8 months, the winter before she married my father. He had absolutely no idea I existed. I sat on his address for 3 weeks before I did anything with it. In my job, I'm the one who reaches out to strangers holding news that can undo a person's whole understanding of themselves. And I know better than almost anyone how easily that kind of contact can go wrong if it's rushed. More than once, I considered not reaching out at all. But I kept coming back to one plain fact. Whatever choice my mother had made 35 years earlier, Harlan Voss hadn't been given a vote in it either. I wrote him a letter instead of calling, because a letter gives a person room to say no without an audience. He wrote back in 11 days. His handwriting was careful, the kind that comes from a man who still measures twice before he cuts. He asked if he could take me to lunch. He signed it, "Whatever you decide, I'm glad you found me." I met Harlan Voss on a Tuesday in April at a diner outside Bardstown, and within 20 minutes across that table, I understood something about my whole life I hadn't let myself understand before. I sat in the parking lot for 10 minutes before I went in, rehearsing an opening line I never ended up using, because the second I saw him stand up from the booth to shake my hand, awkward, a little too formal, clearly as nervous as I was, every rehearsed line I'd prepared evaporated. He listened like it cost him something to get it right. He asked about my work and actually wanted the answer. When the check came, he reached for it before I could, not to prove anything, just because that was who he was. He'd left his phone in the truck, so he wrote his number on a paper napkin in that same careful hand, and I have kept that napkin in my wallet for 9 years now, soft at every fold, because it was the first thing anyone in my bloodline had ever handed me, without also handing me a condition. Over the next 2 years, Harlan became the quiet second life I never mentioned at my parents' table. Dinner every few months, a key to his shop so I could use the bandsaw on evenings I wanted to build something with my hands instead of my head. His sister Junie sent me a birthday card every year unprompted, the kind with a $5 bill folded inside, like I was still 12 years old and worth celebrating exactly as I was. One Thanksgiving, the same week I'd sat through the Callahan version at Larkspur Ridge saying almost nothing, I drove out to Harlan and Junie's afterward with a pie I'd made myself, and ate a second dinner at 8 at night, and laughed harder in that kitchen than I had all day. I never once felt like an audit at that table. I felt like an entry that had always belonged in the ledger, just filed for 30-some years under the wrong name. Harlan taught me things nobody at Larkspur Ridge ever thought to. How to true a warped board on a bandsaw without losing a finger. How to tell, just by the give of the wood, whether a chair was worth repairing or worth letting go. Once, on a slow Sunday, he handed me a cheap harmonica he kept in the shop's junk drawer and taught me 3 notes of an old hymn, badly, both of us laughing too hard to finish it. None of it was significant on its own. All of it, together, was the first evidence I'd ever had that a parent could simply enjoy having me around, with nothing writing on it. The closest I ever came to being caught was the spring Harlan had his gallbladder out. I sat in the surgical waiting room for 4 hours, holding Junie's hand, and when my phone lit up with a text from my mother asking why I hadn't answered her call about Sunday dinner, I remember staring at both messages side by side, one family that had no idea where I actually was, and one family that had just handed me a cup of vending machine coffee and told me, unprompted, that they were glad I'd come. I didn't answer my mother until the next morning. I told her I'd had a work emergency. It wasn't a lie exactly. It just wasn't the whole shape of the truth. 3 weeks after that surgery, Harlan sat me down at his kitchen table, still moving carefully, and told me he'd had his lawyer draw up a trust while he was under the shadow of anesthesia, thinking too hard, the way you do after a surgeon mentions something on a scan that wasn't the gallbladder. He said he didn't want to make a production out of it. He just wanted it done, in writing, in case he ever ran out of time to say the rest of it out loud. I told him he didn't owe me anything, that I hadn't come looking for money, only for the truth of who he was. He looked at me the way he always did, like the answer was obvious. I know I don't owe you anything, Ren. That's exactly why I want to give it to you. I didn't argue with him again after that. Some gifts, I've learned, are really just a person's way of putting their love somewhere it can't be taken back later. I told exactly one person, my college roommate Monica, who has known me long enough to recognize when I'm building a case file instead of feeling my feelings. She sat with me the week I got the results and asked the only question that mattered. Are you protecting yourself, or are you just scared? I told her probably both. She didn't tell me to confront my family. She just said, then don't do anything until you're not scared anymore. Wait until it's a decision, not a flinch. I have thought about that sentence more than almost anything else anyone has ever said to me. Every year or two after that, usually over a glass of wine on her back porch, Monica would ask me some version of the same question. Are you ready yet? And for years my answer stayed exactly the same. Not yet. Soon. When it's a decision and not a flinch. Here's the thing about growing up in a family that measures love by blood and land. You learn to notice exactly how thin the ice is, long before anyone else will admit there's ice at all. So I waited, and I watched, and I built my case file the way I'd build one for any client. Dated, sourced, quiet. Because I did not yet understand what a truth like this would cost me in a household that had spent 3 generations deciding land mattered more than honesty. I wanted to know the whole shape of the thing before I ever set it down in front of anyone. There were ordinary Tuesday dinners during those years, where I'd watch my mother pass the mashed potatoes and think, you have no idea what I know, and feel something that wasn't quite triumph and wasn't quite grief. Just a strange, private steadiness, like standing on solid ground while everyone else still believed the floor was exactly where they'd left it. If you've ever found out that the people raising you had already decided, years before you were old enough to ask, exactly how much of you counted, stay with me. And if you're new here, go ahead and subscribe, because you're going to want to see how far 9 years of quiet can carry a person. My grandfather Earl died 2 winters ago, in February, at 84, in the same bedroom he'd been born in. The funeral was small and dry-eyed, the way farm funerals tend to be. People who've spent a lifetime being careful with words aren't about to get loose with them over a casket. I stood at that graveside in a borrowed black coat between Roger and Tucker, and for one unguarded minute, my mother reached over and took my hand along with Tucker's, the 3 of us in a row like we'd always been exactly that close. I remember thinking, even then, that grief has a way of making a family briefly honest, right before the paperwork reminds everyone how to go back to being careful. What Earl left behind wasn't just grief. It was the Larkspur Ridge Trust, 212 acres appraised that spring at just under $1,860,000, sitting inside a document his own father Silas had drafted back in 1958, with a clause nobody in my generation had ever actually had to use. The trust said the land passed to verified blood descendants of the Callahan name. For 60 years, that clause had been a formality nobody questioned aloud. Until my mother, sitting in the estate lawyer's office 3 weeks after the funeral, asked a question that should have told me everything, if I hadn't already known the answer for 7 years. She asked whether verified meant a signed affidavit, or whether the attorney could require an actual DNA panel before any disbursement went out. I watched her ask that question and understood, with a kind of clean, cold clarity, exactly what she was building. She wasn't protecting 200 acres from strangers. She was constructing a legal reason to explain something she would otherwise have had to explain herself, in her own words, without a document to hide behind. That same year, our lab got called in on a homicide that had gone cold since 1994, and for the first time in 9 years, Priya put my name on the report as lead genealogist instead of hers. Desmond took me out for cheap tacos to celebrate, and I remember sitting across from him thinking that I now had two case files open at once, one for a stranger who'd been waiting 3 decades to be found, and one for myself, waiting on nothing but my own nerve. Only one of those files, it turned out, was actually finished. Over the months that followed, I logged what I saw the way I log everything, dated, plain, without embellishment, because a fact doesn't need decoration to be true. Item 1. Tucker invited to walk the property line with the estate surveyor. I wasn't asked. Item 2. Tucker copied on 3 emails from the family attorney about the trust structure. I received a forwarded summary, 4 days late, attachments stripped out. Item 3. At Easter, my mother introduced Tucker to a county commissioner as the one who's going to keep this land in the family, while I stood 6 feet away, holding a green bean casserole I'd made from Grandma's own recipe card. Item 4. Tucker's daughter's christening invitation listed him as host of the reception at the homestead, a building I'd been told for 2 years wasn't really set up for entertaining anymore whenever I'd asked about hosting anything there myself. Item 5. In June, the county paper ran a small piece on the orchard's replanting plans and quoted Tucker as the next generation of the Callahan farm, a phrase nobody had ever once applied to me despite the fact that I still drove out twice a month to help with the bookkeeping. I wrote each one down. Not accusations, just facts with dates attached, filed next to the others exactly like it. I still drove out to Larkspur Ridge most weekends that year, mostly because Roger asked me to, and partly because some habits outlast the reasons you started them. In August, I was at my parents' house dropping off a soil kit for my mother's tomatoes, and her phone was sitting face up on the kitchen counter, lit with a thread she'd forgotten to lock. I want to be honest with you. I wasn't looking for it, but my eyes are trained to catch a pattern, and the pattern caught me before I could look away. It was a thread between her and Tucker. I read 4 messages before I made myself set the phone back down. Denise. The attorney says the trust requires DNA verification for any descendant whose parentage has ever been publicly questioned. That covers Wren, given the old rumors. Tucker. Does she know why yet? Denise. Not yet. We tell her at the trust meeting, all together. Better she hears it from family than reads it cold in a legal letter. Tucker. And after that she's out of the trust clean? No fight? Denise. Clean. The document does the explaining for us. We just have to be in the room when it lands. I read it twice, the way you'd read a lab result you'd already half suspected, but needed to see printed out in order to fully believe. I set the phone back at the exact angle I'd found it. I drove home with both hands steady on the wheel, and for the first time in 2 years, I let myself feel something close to relief, because the waiting was almost over, and I already knew something they didn't, that the document doing the explaining was about to run in a direction none of them had considered even once. I spent the 2 weeks after that deciding on the order of things, the way I'd plan the reveal of any complicated case file to a family who wasn't ready for it. Monica made me say the words out loud on her back porch 3 separate times, refining them each round, because she said the version I rehearsed first still sounded like I was apologizing for existing. "You're not on trial here," she told me. "Stop talking like the defense." I considered doing it quietly instead. A letter, a lawyer, no audience at all. But they had built their plan for a room full of witnesses, and somewhere around the second rehearsal, I decided the truth deserved the same room the secret had been kept in for 35 years. If you've ever watched people you love build an entire case against you without knowing you'd already built your own, tell me in the comments. And if this story is doing what I think it's doing to your evening, hit subscribe, because the dinner is coming, and you're going to want to see exactly how far this goes. The trust meeting was set for the Saturday before Thanksgiving, at the homestead, with the estate attorney present, both my parents, Tucker and his wife, my Aunt Netta, and me. My mother called it a family dinner. In my own log, I called it Item 12, Scheduled Disclosure. I wore the plainest thing I owned. I brought a green bean casserole because that's what you brought to that house, and I brought a slim folder in my bag that had been sitting untouched in my desk drawer for exactly as long as I'd needed it to. The drive out took 40 minutes, same as it always had, past the turnoff to Harlan's shop, and then another 25 minutes further into hill country I'd known my whole life. The homestead looked exactly like it always did in late November. The orchard bare, the porch light on, smoke already rising from the chimney Grandpa Earl had rebuilt with his own hands the year I turned 10. I sat in my car in that driveway for almost a full minute before I went in, the way I imagine most people do before a meeting they've been quietly rehearsing for months. Then I picked up the casserole dish, felt the folder's weight against my hip through my bag, and walked in like it was any other Saturday. Dinner went the way dinners in that house always went. Pleasant, careful, everyone performing a version of normal they'd rehearsed without admitting they were rehearsing it. Tucker's wife asked about my work. I told her about a case I'd just helped close, and watched my mother's smile hold perfectly still while I talked, the way a smile holds when a person is timing something. My mother waited until the plates were cleared, and the attorney had opened his folder before she stood, wine glass in hand, and said she had something the whole family needed to hear together. She talked for almost 2 minutes before she got to the point, the way people do when they've rehearsed the delivery more than the content. She talked about honoring Earl's wishes, about protecting what generations of Callahans had built, about a verification step none of us could have anticipated. And then she looked at me. Not unkindly, the way you look at someone you've already decided in advance to feel sorry for, and told the table that my father, my Roger, was not my biological father, that a panel would confirm it, that under the terms of Earl's trust, that meant the land could never pass through me. Then she said it. The line I had been carrying around in my chest for 2 years, waiting to hear out loud instead of only imagining it. This land goes to blood. You were never blood. The table went quiet, the specific way a room goes quiet, when everyone in it is waiting to see whether a person is about to break. 4 seconds. I counted them, same as I count everything, because counting is the only thing that keeps my hand steady when the rest of me wants to shake. I did not break. I set down my fork, and I reached into my bag, and I felt every eye at that table follow my hand, the way you'd watch a hand move toward something nobody knew was there. I know, I said. I've known for 9 years. I want you to picture my mother's face in that moment, because I had 2 years to imagine it, and the real thing was better than anything I'd pictured. Not shock, exactly. The particular unraveling of a person who has spent a decade rehearsing a scene where she holds every card, only to learn the other person memorized the whole script years ago and has simply been waiting, patiently, for her cue. I laid the first document on the tablecloth, a lab report dated 9 years back, my own signature on the release form, my supervisor's stamp in the corner. This is the panel, I said. I ran it myself, at work, the December I turned 26. Shared DNA with Roger, 0. I've had this longer than the two of you have been building this plan. My mother's mouth opened. Nothing came out of it yet. I laid the second item down beside it. A paper napkin, soft at every fold, the ink gone slightly gray with age, a phone number and 11 words in a careful, measuring hand. This is from the day I met my biological father, I said. His name is Harlan Voss. He lives 40 minutes from this table. When he found out he had a daughter, he never once asked me for anything in exchange for loving me. My Aunt Netta had her hand pressed over her mouth. Tucker's wife had gone very still beside him, the particular stillness of a person doing quiet math about a marriage she'd walked into, assuming she understood the whole family. Tucker himself was staring at the tablecloth like it might rearrange itself into a version of this dinner he could survive. I laid the third document down last, because you save the heart for the end. A trust agreement, 3 pages, notarized, Harlan's careful post-surgery signature from 6 months back, after a health scare that had frightened me more than any part of the story I'm telling you tonight. Harlan built a trust of his own, I said. It isn't 200 acres. It's a repair shop and a little over $300,000, put together slowly over an honest lifetime. Every dollar of it has my name on it, freely, without a single test attached, because he never once needed one to decide I was his. Nobody spoke. The attorney, to his credit, had gone very still, the way professionals go still when they realize the meeting they were hired for is no longer the meeting actually happening in the room. My mother found her voice first, and it came out exactly the way I had catalogued, over 2 years of imagining this, that it would. Not soft, not sorry, furious. You've known for 9 years, and you let us plan this. You let us stand here and— Mom, Tucker said quietly, the first thing he'd said all night. Maybe let her finish. It was such a small sentence. It was also the bravest thing I ever heard my brother say at that table. And it is entirely possible that years from now, it's the thing I forgive him for everything else because of. I let you show me who you already were, I said. I didn't write that clause into a will 60 years before I was born. I didn't make you ask a lawyer whether you could force your own daughter to prove herself with a cheek swab instead of just telling her the truth quietly, the way a person who loved her would have. I only waited until you were ready to say it out loud, with witnesses, so nobody at this table could ever tell me later that I imagined it. That's when my father, Roger, the only father I have ever wanted, pushed his chair back, and I braced, because I genuinely did not know, in that second, which direction he was about to go. He didn't look at Denise at all. He looked straight at me, and he said the only thing in that entire room that actually mattered. You've always been mine, Ren. Paperwork never once had a vote in that, and it doesn't get one now either. Then he reached over and set his hand flat on top of the lab report, like he was shielding it, the way you'd cover something fragile from weather. My mother's face did crack, just once, just for a second. Not the rehearsed kind of crack she'd been performing for 2 months, but something real and frightened underneath it. The look of a woman realizing the story she'd told herself for 35 years had just been read back to her by the one person who'd actually kept score the whole time. Then it closed back over, fast, the way a wound closes before a person is ready to let it heal. This doesn't change what the trust says, she said. The attorney cleared his throat and said, carefully, that the panel requirement in Silas's original 1958 language was, in his professional opinion, likely to hold regardless of any other documents on the table, that the clause cared about biology, not about who else happened to love me. I told him I understood that completely, and that he didn't need to worry, because I had no intention of contesting a single word of it. I don't want the trust, I said, and I meant it in a way that surprised even me, sitting there. I don't want 200 acres that only ever loved me on a technicality. Keep the land, Mom. Give it to Tucker. Just don't ever tell me again that I wasn't blood, in a room where you already knew exactly whose blood I was. I gathered my 3 pages back into the folder. I thanked my mother for the dinner, because Harlan taught me once that leaving with your manners intact costs you nothing, and tells the room everything it needs to know. I drove home past the turnoff to Harlan's shop, lit up warm and yellow in my rearview mirror, and I cried the whole 40 minutes, not from grief. From the plain, specific relief of finally setting down something I'd been carrying alone for 9 years. Before I tell you what happened after, hit subscribe. Some of the calmest endings take the longest to arrive, and this one is worth staying for. The weeks that followed were quieter than I expected, the way the weeks after any storm tend to be. Tucker texted once, 4 days later. I didn't know about the shop money. I don't know what to do with any of this yet. Mom's been different since Saturday. I don't know what to do with that either. I told him he didn't have to do anything with any of it tonight, or this month, or maybe ever. That some things just need to sit with a person until they're actually ready to be picked up. My Aunt Netta called twice, the second time to actually apologize, the only one at that table who did. I knew there was something, she told me, her voice smaller than I'd ever heard it. I told myself it wasn't mine to say. I've had 30 years to decide that was a coward's excuse, and I only just got around to admitting it. I told her I understood, more than she knew, exactly how a family teaches its members to look away, because I'd learned the same lesson from the other direction. My mother did not call. The trust finalized in March, the land passing intact to Tucker, exactly the way the 60-year-old clause had always intended once the panel confirmed what I'd already known for 9 years. I didn't contest it. I didn't want to. Some inheritances aren't worth what it costs to keep them. Priya was the second person at the lab to hear the whole story, after Desmond, and she listened the way she always listens to a case that's finally closed. Quietly, then with one dry, perfect line. "Well," she said, "at least the paperwork's good." It became a joke between us, the kind you only get to make once in a career, about which of my two open files had actually needed solving more. Roger calls me every single Sunday now, same as he always has, except the calls run longer these days, because we're both a little more honest in them than we used to be. Harlan and I still have dinner every few months, and this spring he taught me to true up a warped table leg on his bandsaw, the two of us standing in sawdust, while Junie hollered from the porch that supper was getting cold. Nobody at that table has ever once asked me to prove that I belonged there. Last Thanksgiving, for the first time in 9 years, I didn't have two dinners to keep straight in my head. I had one, at Harlan and Junie's, with Roger sitting at the far end of the table, because I'd finally introduced the two of them myself, over pie, the two men in my life comparing notes on woodworking like they'd known each other for years instead of months. Denise wasn't there. I didn't expect her to be. Some tables you build one plate at a time, with the people who already know how to set them. Here's what 9 years of finding other people's family trees and 9 years of quietly building my own case finally taught me. Blood is just a measurement. It tells you where you came from. It has never once, in any file I've built for a stranger or for myself, told you who actually shows up. That part, every single time, turns out to be a choice, made over and over, in ordinary rooms, by people who never once needed a lab report to make it. If you've ever had to prove, on paper, something the people who really loved you never once needed proof of, comment chosen family, so I know you're still with me. And if this one landed the way I think it did, share it with somebody who's been quietly keeping score in a family that never thought to check the math. I'll see you in the next one.